Hey there. I offer this podcast freely. Your support really makes a difference. To make a donation, visit reneemckenna.com. Welcome to Spiritual Psychology. My name's Renee McKenna, and I bring my 30-plus years as a recovering addict and ex-crazy person turned therapist and shamanic healer to bring you snackable teachings on spirituality, psychology, and all things personal growth. And today I want to talk about how our perspective creates our experience, and perhaps how our experience actually creates our reality. Now, I'm sitting on a chair recording this podcast. Now, depending upon my perspective or worldview at this moment right now, I can have a completely different experience of this podcast recording process. If I was feeling particularly bad about myself today, in a place of shame, I might think, I don't have anything to say that anybody wants to hear. This is stupid. And I might give up recording altogether. That shame is a perspective. Or I might be in a perspective of hopelessness, despair, or apathy. I could think, I've been making this podcast for 3.5 years. What difference does it make anyway? This is a useless waste of my time. And again, I might not make the podcast. Alternately, I could have a perspective of fear and anxiety. What if people judge me or don't like what I have to say? Or maybe people will like the podcast and then I'll have to meet some external expectations that I'll be unable to meet. And that perspective of fear and anxiety could also make me withdraw from the recording process. I could record from the perspective of desire or wanting, craving fame, notoriety, people to see me in some particular way. Now, that might get me to record the podcast, but I might only talk about things that I think other people want me to hear or say things to impress others rather than telling my deeper truth. And if I didn't get what I wanted, that might make me angry, resentful. And there can be a lot of energy in the perspective of anger or hatred. In fact, there's tons of talk radio and YouTube that's all hate-feeding anger perspective. Actually generates particular emotional resonance that a lot of people really like to feed on. I know I've been an anger feeder much of my life. Being outraged. Lots of us really dig a perspective of outrage and feeling justified by that. In fact, justified outrage can breed a different perspective, which is pride. Self-inflation, feeling like I'm right and other people are wrong. And I could create a podcast telling you guys the right way to view the world and how all the other people who view it differently, those different perspectives, are wrong or stupid, even dangerous or evil. And all those perspectives that I've described so far are actually all fairly self-centered. They have a lot to do with my own ego being very important. Even if the way my ego is important means that I'm unimportant, if I'm in shame or apathy, or if my ego or personality self is maybe more important than others and I am in this position of pride, but they all have me sitting in the same chair, attempting to record a podcast. So there's a reality of the chair and the microphone, but my experience of it and my relationship to it is completely different depending on my perspective. Some of those perspectives might have me not be able to even sit in the chair. I might be too afraid or shamed, or if I'm enraged or feeling superior, each of those is going to give me a really different experience of recording, and what comes out of my mouth, what I put into the world, is going to have a really different resonance as well. And what I've just described is the lower end of this scale of human perspective that's described by many, many teachers. Right now I'm working off of the map of consciousness created by David Hawkins, but an almost identical scale exists in the teaching of Abraham Hicks. Abraham Hicks calls it the emotional guidance scale, and I've been working with the teachings of Frederick Dodson and what he calls levels of energy. And this idea of levels of consciousness or the evolution of the human soul is not a modern idea. In the Christian tradition, it can be found in The Ladder of Divine Ascent by the monk John Climacus in the 6th and 7th century. The Catholic mystic Teresa of Avila talked about the interior castle in the 1500s, and it's been touched on in Buddhism. The Dalai Lama talks about this scale of consciousness evolution in his book, The Meaning of Life. And he illuminates the 9 realms of hell, which basically mimic these same lower or more self-centered perspectives that I just described. And the modern Sufi mystic Llewellyn Vaughan Lee talks about the 12 levels of initiation. And although they may vary in wording and context, the essence of these diverse teachings is that seekers of truth go through many stages. And experientially, the stages may not be linear, but there is a definite evolution of consciousness for all of us. I personally believe that the earth plane is a consciousness generating machine. And although I have no proof of it, all of the evidence seems to point to the idea that there is some aspect of our being, our soul substance, that seems to go through multiple lifetimes on this evolutionary process. And the goal of that evolutionary process seems to be reunion with the One, nirvana, enlightenment, bliss, joy, and awakening. I think we are all on that same journey, and a very, 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 very few of us may make it all the way into that awakened state. But even those who call themselves enlightened admit that there are many, many seemingly infinite stages to that as well. But don't be discouraged if enlightenment in this lifetime is your goal. We're all here to make progress. And progress, I believe, is what really makes us happy. And happiness is the reward. Suffering is information that we're going in the wrong direction. And eventually, I believe we do all end up traveling this giant river of life force and consciousness, cycling back into the same ultimate destination of unity and oneness. And I don't think that's a static experience either, because the life force is always in motion. There's an energetic configuration called a torus, which is kind of like a big energy donut. And energy in a torus flows out of the top hole, out around the outside of the donut, and back in the bottom in an endless cycle of regeneration, which produces more energy generation. And so there's this beautiful flowing outward and back inward cycle that I think can be very instructive for understanding this idea that our perspective creates our experience and perhaps even creates our reality. That what we put out comes back to us. And as I just described, our perspective or worldview actually has a big influence on what we put out. If I'm in a perspective of shame or fear or guilt, hopelessness, judgment, those each produce a particular vibration. They certainly give me a different felt experience of my sitting in the chair in front of a microphone. So it can all be me sitting here, but depending upon my perspective, I'm going to have a completely different experience. And those perspectives actually have a lot to do with the choices that I make that have huge implications in my own participation in reality creation. So if I'm in shame and think, I don't have anything to offer the world, I'm not even going to create a podcast. If I'm in fear, hopelessness, same thing, different experiences internally about it, but I still might not even be able to show up. If I'm seeking approval or love from others, if I'm wanting ideas of success, if I'm desiring to change the world, or wanting to share my judgment and perspective on the right way to do things and shame all those who are doing it differently, each of those is going to create much different content. It'll attract different listeners, will give me a very different feedback loop in my torus donut of energy and what I put out and what I get back. Now, the great news is we actually have agency and control over our perspective. We are not powerless over our perspective. It can and absolutely should be changed if it's causing us suffering or causing other people suffering. In fact, over time, according to these evolutionary scales of consciousness, it will change, grow, and evolve. Because we are all, again, from my perspective, flowing along this river of consciousness evolution, whether we're floating along it happily, rowing our boat to move a little faster, or clinging to the shore, resisting the current. we're all in the same flow and ultimately, I believe, end up back in the arms of the god or goddess of our understanding, reintegrated consciously into the unified field, connecting with the truth of the divinity that is within each of us. We may take lots of detours, but I think we cannot be separated from that with which we are. There is this, I believe, Hindu tradition that all of creation is the breathing out and breathing in of the one. The Big Bang is the breathing out. Now, ultimately, there will be a breathing back in. And that breathing out, breathing in is awesome, and we are participating in it, and there's nothing to fear. In fact, most spiritual practice is about relaxing and enjoying the ride. Meditate, let go, think less, just be. The path to peace and fulfillment seems to be more focused on not doing than doing. And these places that most of us are caught, these perspectives of shame, guilt, fear, judgment, envy, hatred, resentment, pride, those perspectives are what David Hawkins calls the level of force that we're imposing our will. And we all do it. It's part of being a human on this plane of existence. If you've evolved past that, you aren't listening to this podcast and you probably don't have a body. So there's nothing wrong with wherever we are. We aren't doing anything bad. But if we're suffering, these scales of consciousness evolution give us a roadmap or a ladder of how to climb out of that pit of suffering that a lot of us are stuck in certain areas of our life. And the tipping point of almost all these scales is the perspective of courage, or an attitude of hope. And courage moves us from this place of forcing our own individual will into a different kind of power. Courage allows us to move into the unknown, to handle opportunities for life, to have energy to learn new skills. There's some capacity to face our own limitations and grow despite them. Courage allows us to do scary things and not be crippled by anxiety. And at the level of courage or hope, we begin to put out into the world as much as we take. At these lower levels of shame, fear, hatred, we're looking for what we can get from life rather than what we can bring to it. That's the self-centeredness. We tend to be a draining, sucking force, always wanting, never fulfilled. At courage, we begin to feel fulfillment and to put out equally what we receive. And that flowing river, that torus donut of energy cycle begins to flow in a more healthy way. And David Hawkins' first extensive book on this subject is called Power versus Force. It's an excellent introduction to this idea of elevating or moving along the evolutionary levels of consciousness, changing our perspective and our felt experience of whatever the circumstances are in our life. And here's the important part. Most of us believe that our perspective is abject reality. We are attached to the glasses that we're wearing to see the world through and don't know that we can get new prescriptions. We think that our worldview is correct, that our perspective is the only one. In fact, we believe that anybody else who doesn't hold that is stupid or magical or dangerous. But all the different perspectives and worldviews are valid, and I would say even necessary to the complexity of the torus nature of what's happening here on Earth. But for our purposes right here, your perspective is not fixed. It can absolutely and probably should be changed and evolved. And it's a really powerful way to observe personal growth. Now, the complexity of this is that we have different perspectives in different areas of our life. And a lot of my work in spiritual psychology is rooting out these places of really low resonance in people, stuck, painful perspectives, and helping to get that energy moving back on this natural track. It's kind of what they do in Chinese medicine, the idea that there are these natural cyclical flows through these different systems in our body, and dis-ease is when things get stagnated. And the same could be true for our emotional, spiritual, mental, relational dynamics. We get stuck in old ways of viewing and seeing things and don't move in a healthy way, maturing along the evolutionary path. which again points to joy, bliss, happiness, connection, fulfillment. And I'll talk about those higher levels in a minute, because that's where most of us want to be. But these lower levels can be really sticky. We get really comfortable with what's familiar. And I've created a printout of these levels of consciousness that you can download. You can shoot me an email, info@reneemckenna.com, or click the link in the show notes. Because the really awesome thing about this scale is that you don't jump from shame to love, although that can happen. That's like a spiritual awakening experience. But moving up this kind of ladder of consciousness, just moving to the next rung gives us a different perspective and moves our energy in a positive way. So for example, shame is one of the lowest resonances we can have as a human. Guilt is actually more elevated than shame. So if we can get into guilt, it's actually positive movement. Despair and hopelessness are actually better than guilt. And if we can get into fear and anxiety, that's actually halfway to courage. Anger has a higher resonance than fear. Pride has a higher resonance than anger. So although particularly for those who are quote unquote spiritually minded, being able to own our own humanity and not try to skip over it, which is called a spiritual bypass. We want to pretend that we don't have anger, that we don't have guilt. I did a podcast on spiritual bypass if you want to learn more about that topic. Episode 43, Spiritual Bypass in 5D. Really allowing ourselves the full expression of these energies kind of grows our muscles as we prepare to be able to hold the higher resonances. Gets us moving. There's no shame in anxiety. There's no shame in pride. There's no shame in being resentful or envious or judgmental. The shame actually stops our ability to look at any of them, puts us right back down to zero. And so it can take courage to face ourselves and be able to hold all of who we are so that we can continue to evolve these different areas of our life. Now, again, we might be really well developed in one area and really underdeveloped in another. We might be highly functional with money, but really sexually dysfunctional. We might be an excellent artist, but have so much social anxiety we can't bring our work into the world. We may love our children, but hate our mother. I know that one. She's dead now, so I can say that. And I don't really hate her anymore because I got to face it and now I have compassion for her. But I did hate her for a long time. And it wasn't until I was able to admit that I was actually able to move it. So observing our particular emotional perspectives on any area of our life is really important because when we can observe them, I'm going to tell you, you can change them. The only fact is that I'm sitting in a chair. How I sit in this chair, what I do when I'm in this chair, the implications of my felt experience and the choices that I'll make from that place, those create my reality. So any place that we can cultivate courage is a place of opportunity for positive, constructive change. And as we continue to evolve beyond courage, we move into a place of trust, letting go, satisfaction. We can move into willingness, optimism, inspiration, which can generate acceptance, harmony, mercy, forgiveness, transcendence or transformation. This cultivates wisdom, understanding. Life begins to take on deeper meaning. This cultivates love, reverence, compassion, which cultivates joy, serenity, sense of completeness, leading to peace, bliss, illumination, an experience of the perfection of all things, which leads ultimately to enlightenment and pure consciousness. If I create this podcast from a place of courage, then I'm going to take risks and be willing to put myself out there and just see what happens. It can be playful, adventurous, even fun. And from that place of trust, I might be satisfied with what I create and letting go of the outcome, which really allows for even more flow. It may generate hope, inspiration, and willingness, optimism to create more things, to just be interested in what I'm putting out into the world more than what I'm getting back. Although when I'm in that position or perspective of hope, optimism, and willingness, it generates a really positive energy that has a tremendous reciprocal flow. I get a lot back from what I put out. Now, I'm going to be perfectly honest. These higher levels of wisdom, understanding, love, joy, peace, and bliss, I can only touch on those. But we are supposed to touch on those. And those ecstatic, joyful, fulfilling experiences pull us forward and generate even more energy, more power. And so I have found these scales of consciousness or emotional perspective to be invaluable in my own personal growth work and working with others. To be able to observe my personal perspective on these different areas of my life and know that they are changeable. So to particularly look for places of conflict and what is my perspective or resonance that I'm bringing to it. So if I have difficulties at work, challenges with money, issues around sexuality or my relationship, what's the state of my living circumstance of my home? What's the health of my body? And it's pretty simple. We can just ask, how do I feel about any of those things? How do I feel about my body? Do I have shame, guilt, anger, judgment, pride? Or do I have courage, love, hopefulness, acceptance? How do I feel about my work? Do I have anxiety, guilt, envy? Or do I have willingness, optimism, joy? What do I bring to the relationships in my life? Do I bring condemnation, humiliation, antagonism? Or do I bring trust, harmony, understanding, hope? We all have places of lower resonance, and we all have places of higher resonance. Our perspectives are not fixed. They can absolutely be changed. In fact, I would say the opportunities to change them are ever present. And when we change our perspective, it changes our felt experience. It changes the choices that we make and the actions that we take, and ultimately creates the reality that we experience at any given time. So check out my free download and have the courage to take a look at where you are being called to grow and evolve toward peace, bliss, and happiness in your life. Thank you so much for listening. I have a couple of free lives coming up. This Wednesday, September 20th, 2023, Connecting with Source. I'm going to talk about and actually lead you through some practices to connect with power in a really direct and practical way. And Wednesday, the 27th of September, I'm going to do a live workshop on transforming trauma. And these are free events both at 3 p.m. Eastern, that's noon Pacific. Wednesday, the 20th, Connecting with Source. Wednesday, the 27th, Transforming Trauma. And I'm experimenting with going live across platforms. So these are going to go out on my YouTube channel and on Insight Timer. It'll get less complicated as I figure out these tools. So you can tune into my Insight Timer or my YouTube channel. There's links for both of those in the show notes. I usually work in blocks of sessions with people of 5, 10, or 15, but I am offering single sessions, 40-minute discovery sessions. You can go to the bookings drop down on my website, reneemckenna.com, if you'd like to do an individual session with me. Check out how spiritual psychology work might benefit you in your life. Deep gratitude to my supporters on Patreon and through this podcast. Blessings on your path until we meet again. This is Renee McKenna for Spiritual Psychology.